It's strange how a man can legally own a seat and still be told he doesn't belong in it. This seat isn't for you. Move. Now. The words didn't echo, they sliced clean through the quiet hum of the first-class cabin, sharp enough to turn heads but controlled enough to feel like policy instead of insult, and yet everyone within 3 rows felt it, that subtle shift in the air, like something had just gone wrong in a place where everything is supposed to feel right. Ethan Cole didn't move. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, didn't even look surprised. He just sat there in seat 2A, shoulders relaxed, hands resting lightly on the armrests as if he had all the time in the world, dressed in a plain black t-shirt, dark jeans, and sneakers that had seen better days, nothing about him signaling status, nothing about him demanding attention, and maybe that was the problem. The flight attendant, Nicole Harris, stood just a step too close, her posture rigid, her smile tight in a way that didn't reach her eyes, waiting for resistance she could justify escalating, but it never came. Instead, Ethan slowly turned his head toward her, not with defiance, but with something quieter, something almost curious, and then, unexpectedly, he smiled. Not a wide grin, not mockery, just a small, controlled expression that didn't match the tension building around him, and that smile did more to unsettle her than any argument could have. A man across the aisle lowered his newspaper. A woman 2 rows back paused mid-sip, her glass hovering just inches from her lips. Even the low murmur of pre-flight chatter seemed to thin out, like the cabin itself was waiting to see what would happen next. "Sir, I'm going to need you to cooperate," Nicole added, her voice firmer now, louder by just a fraction, enough to signal authority without losing composure, but Ethan still didn't move. Instead, he glanced briefly at the boarding pass in her hand, the one with his name printed clearly, the one she hadn't actually read, and then back at her, his expression unchanged. "That's interesting," he said finally, his voice calm, measured, almost conversational, like they were discussing something trivial instead of the fact that he was being asked to give up a seat he had paid for, a seat that was, by every measurable system, his. Nicole's jaw tightened. She wasn't used to this kind of response. People argued, protested, raised their voices, tried to prove something. But this quiet refusal wrapped in composure, felt different, harder to control. Behind her, another flight attendant leaned in, whispering something under her breath, a quick glance exchanged, the kind that happens when a situation doesn't go the way it's supposed to. And then, as if right on cue, a well-dressed couple stepped into the aisle, their presence polished, effortless, the kind of look that fit perfectly into first class without question, and Nicole turned slightly toward them, her tone shifting just enough to be noticed. "We'll have your seat ready in just a moment," she said to them, not to Ethan, as if the decision had already been made, as if the outcome was never really in doubt. That was the moment the cabin felt it, the imbalance, the quiet assumption sliding into place, and still, Ethan Cole didn't react the way they expected. He didn't argue. He didn't stand. He didn't defend himself. He just leaned back slightly into the seat that wasn't supposed to be his eyes steady, his smile fading into something more neutral, more focused, like he was watching a story unfold that he had already seen before, a story that always started the same way. And somewhere beneath that calm, beneath that silence, something else was beginning to take shape, something invisible to everyone else on that plane, something that didn't need to raise its voice to be heard. The smile did not disappear, but it changed, settling into something quieter, something that did not ask for permission to stay. Nicole noticed it, even if she could not explain why it unsettled her, and for a brief second her confidence flickered before she recovered it with a sharper tone. "Sir, I am not going to repeat myself," she said, her voice carrying just enough to pull more attention from nearby passengers, turning a private moment into something public, something performative. Ethan did not look at her immediately. Instead, he glanced out the oval window beside him, where the runway stretched long and still under the late afternoon sun, a line of aircraft waiting their turn like pieces on a board, each one moving according to a system that rarely questioned itself. Then he looked back at her, calm as ever. "You already did," he replied, not confrontational, not sarcastic, just factual, and that somehow made it land heavier. Behind Nicole, Brian Foster stepped forward, his expression carrying that familiar mix of impatience and certainty, the kind that comes from believing the situation is already understood. "Look, man, we are trying to keep things moving," he said, folding his arms, his voice casual but edged with dismissal. "That seat has been reassigned." Ethan tilted his head slightly, as if considering the statement rather than challenging it. "Reassigned," he repeated, letting the word sit in the air for a moment, as though it deserved closer inspection. A few rows back, a young woman shifted in her seat, her phone already in her hand, not recording yet but ready, her eyes moving between Ethan and the crew with growing curiosity. The couple standing in the aisle remained there, waiting, their presence polished and patient, but there was a subtle expectation in the way they held themselves, as if delays like this were not something they were used to. Nicole turned toward Ethan again, this time holding the torn edge of his boarding pass more tightly, though she had not yet realized she was gripping it. "We have priority guests boarding," she said, each word placed carefully, as if the phrase itself justified everything happening in front of them. Ethan's eyes moved briefly to the couple, then back to Nicole. "And I am not one of them," he said, finishing the sentence she did not say out loud. There was no accusation in his tone, only clarity, and that clarity made the space between them feel smaller, more exposed. Brian let out a short breath, half laugh, half dismissal. "You said it, not us," he replied, though the line had already been drawn. Across the aisle, the man with the newspaper lowered it completely now, no longer pretending to read, his gaze fixed on the interaction unfolding like a scene that had stepped out of routine. The quiet of the cabin had shifted again, no longer just tense but attentive, as if everyone understood that something more than a seating issue was taking place, even if no one said it directly. Ethan rested his hands together loosely, fingers interlaced, his posture unchanged, grounded in a way that did not match the pressure building around him. "Then let me make this simple," he said, his voice still even, still controlled, but now carrying a weight. That had not been there before. "I booked this seat. I paid for this seat. And I am sitting in this seat." No raised voice, no emphasis beyond what was necessary, and yet the statement landed with a finality that forced a pause, even from Nicole. For a brief moment, no one spoke. The system had encountered something it was not designed to process, a refusal without chaos, a challenge without aggression. Nicole's expression tightened again, her authority pushing back against that stillness. "Then you are refusing a direct instruction from crew," she said, framing the moment in terms that gave her control again, or at least the appearance of it. Ethan met her gaze, steady and unblinking. "No," he said quietly. "I am accepting the one printed on that ticket." And somewhere in the back of the cabin, the young woman with the phone finally pressed record, because even she could feel it now, the shift from inconvenience to something that was about to matter. The small red recording light on the phone in the third row blinked quietly, unnoticed by most, but not by everyone. A man in a navy blazer leaned slightly into the aisle, pretending to adjust his carry-on while angling his view toward Ethan, his expression shifting from casual curiosity to something more focused, more aware. Moments like this had a way of revealing people, not just the ones at the center, but the ones watching, choosing whether to stay silent or step closer. Nicole noticed the phones now, the subtle shift from observation to documentation, and her posture stiffened again, authority tightening like a uniform she refused to let slip. "Sir, you are disrupting pre-boarding," she said, her voice sharper, more official, each word chosen to reframe the situation away from what it felt like and back into something procedural. Ethan did not look at the phones. He did not acknowledge the growing audience. His focus remained exactly where it had been from the beginning, steady and deliberate, as if the only thing that mattered was the conversation directly in front of him. "I am sitting," he replied, his tone unchanged, "and you are asking me to leave a seat that is assigned to me. If there is a disruption here, it did not start with me." The sentence landed clean, without hesitation, and for a brief moment, even Brian seemed to hesitate, his confidence recalibrating in real time. Behind them, the couple still stood waiting, but now there was a flicker of discomfort in the way they shifted their weight, as if the situation was no longer as simple as they had expected. The woman glanced briefly at Ethan, then away, her grip tightening slightly on her handbag, caught between expectation and something she could not quite name. "This is not about you," Brian said quickly, trying to regain ground, though the statement itself only made the air feel heavier, as if the opposite were now obvious to everyone listening. Ethan's eyes moved to him, calm but sharper now, not confrontational, just more precise. "It became about me the moment you decided I did not belong here," he said, and this time, the words did not just sit in the space, they reshaped it. A quiet murmur moved through the nearby rows, not loud enough to be called out, but present enough to be felt, like a ripple spreading outward. Nicole exhaled slowly, then straightened, shifting tactics again, leaning into authority instead of argument. "Captain will be making a decision shortly," she said, her voice steady but carrying a hint of urgency now, the kind that comes when control starts to slip. "Until then, I need you to comply." Ethan nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, as if the statement had been logged, processed, and set aside. "Then we can both wait," he replied. The simplicity of it unsettled her more than resistance ever could have. Time stretched in that cabin, each second carrying more weight than the last, until the soft sound of footsteps approached from the front, measured, deliberate, the kind that signaled authority before a single word was spoken. Captain Daniel Pierce stepped into view, tall, composed, his presence immediately shifting attention toward him, drawing eyes away from phones and back to the center of the moment. He took in the scene quickly, the standing passengers, the crew positioned just a little too tensely, and finally Ethan, seated, unmoved, as if none of the pressure in the room had touched him. "What seems to be the issue here?" the captain asked, his tone controlled, neutral, the voice of someone used to resolving problems by defining them. Nicole stepped forward first, eager to frame the narrative before it could form on its own. "Passenger refusing to comply with seating." "Adjustment," she said, concise, clean, leaving out everything that made the situation complicated. The captain nodded slowly, then turned his attention to Ethan, studying him for a moment longer than expected, as if searching for something that did not immediately present itself. Ethan met his gaze without hesitation, without explanation, just presence, steady and unyielding. And in that brief silence between them, something shifted again, subtle but undeniable, like the beginning of a realization that had not yet reached the surface. Captain Daniel Pierce did not rush his judgment, and that alone made the silence stretch longer than anyone expected, his eyes moving once from Ethan to Nicole, then briefly to the couple still standing in the aisle, and back again as if he was assembling a version of events in real time. "Sir," he began, his tone measured, not hostile but firm in a way that carried the weight of final authority inside that aircraft, "I am being told there is a seating conflict." Ethan gave a slight nod, acknowledging the phrasing without agreeing to it, his posture unchanged, grounded in a calm that felt increasingly out of place in a cabin that was now fully alert. "There is no conflict on my end," Ethan replied, his voice steady, clear, each word placed with intention. "There is a seat with my name on it, and I am in it." The captain's expression did not shift much, but there was a pause, subtle and deliberate, as if the simplicity of that statement required more processing than the situation should have. Nicole stepped in quickly, unwilling to let the narrative slip from her control. "The system shows a reassignment," she said, her tone tightening, her confidence leaning heavily on the idea of authority backed by process. "We need him to move so we can accommodate priority boarding." The captain glanced toward the handheld device in her hand, then back to Ethan, and something in his gaze sharpened slightly, not suspicion, not yet, but attention. "Do you have your identification and boarding confirmation, sir?" he asked. Ethan reached slowly into the front pocket of his jeans, not rushed, not defensive, and pulled out his phone, the screen lighting up in his hand as he navigated with a few precise taps before turning it outward. "Already checked in. Already scanned. Seat 2A, he said, holding it just long enough for the captain to see, then lowering it again without insisting, without pushing the evidence forward. The captain nodded once, absorbing the information, but before he could respond, Brian spoke again, his tone now edged with impatience. "We see fake confirmations all the time," he said, crossing his arms again as if reinforcing the statement with posture. "That does not mean anything." A quiet reaction moved through the nearby rows, not loud, but enough to be felt, the kind of collective discomfort that builds when something stops making sense. Ethan's gaze shifted to Brian, not confrontational, but precise, like he was measuring the distance between assumption and fact. "Then maybe it is time to stop treating everything that does not fit your expectation as fake," he said, his voice still even, but now carrying a sharper edge of truth that did not need volume to be heard. The captain exhaled slowly, his authority now caught between two versions of the same situation, one built on procedure, the other on presence. He looked again at Nicole. Was the reassignment confirmed through the system or requested at the gate, he asked, and for the first time, Nicole hesitated, just a fraction, but enough for it to register. It was handled during boarding, she replied, her answer technically correct, but incomplete in a way that made the air tighten again. The captain's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in focus, as if a piece of the situation had just shifted out of alignment. Behind them, the quiet click of another phone camera starting to record added to the growing sense that this moment was no longer contained within the cabin, that it was being witnessed, stored, and possibly questioned beyond this space. Ethan leaned back just slightly in his seat, his fingers resting calmly against the armrest, his composure unchanged even as the tension around him thickened. "Captain," he said, his tone respectful, but unmistakably firm, "you can resolve this quickly by asking one simple question." The captain looked at him, waiting. Ethan met his gaze without hesitation. "Why was my seat reassigned after I already boarded and checked in under my name?" The question landed differently than everything else that had been said so far, not emotional, not defensive, but structural, aimed directly at the system itself rather than the people enforcing it, and for a brief moment, no one answered, because for the first time, the problem was no longer about a man in the wrong seat, it was about a decision that might not hold up under scrutiny. The question did not fade after it was spoken, it stayed in the air, pressing gently against every person within earshot, forcing them to sit with it longer than they wanted to. Captain Pierce did not answer immediately, and that hesitation, small as it was, shifted something fundamental in the balance of the moment. Nicole felt it first, her grip tightening slightly around the device in her hand as if the screen itself could provide the certainty she was beginning to lose. "We followed standard procedure," she said quickly, stepping in before the silence could grow any heavier, her tone firm but now carrying a trace of urgency that had not been there before. The captain did not look at her right away. His attention remained on Ethan, studying him with a sharper focus now, as if reassessing everything he thought he understood about the situation. Ethan did not move. He did not fill the silence. He simply waited, and that patience made the question feel even larger, like something that could not be dismissed without consequence. Behind them, the cabin had changed. It was no longer just quiet. It was aware. Phones were no longer hidden. They were visible now, held at chest level, angled carefully, documenting without interruption. A man in the second row leaned slightly into the aisle and spoke, not loudly, but clearly enough to be heard. He asked a fair question, he said, his voice steady, not aggressive, just present. That single sentence did something the crew could not control. It moved the moment from private authority to public scrutiny. Brian turned toward the voice, his expression tightening. "Sir, please remain seated," he replied, but the words lacked the certainty they carried before. The authority was still there, but it no longer felt absolute. The captain finally shifted his gaze to Nicole. "Show me the reassignment record," he said, his tone calm but now unmistakably directive. Nicole hesitated again, just for a fraction of a second, then turned the device toward him, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. "It was updated during boarding," she repeated, but this time, the explanation felt thinner, less complete. The captain looked down at the screen, his eyes scanning, his expression tightening almost imperceptibly. "There is no timestamp," he said after a moment, his voice quieter now, but sharper, more precise. That detail landed harder than anything else so far. It was not emotional. It was not subjective. It was a gap. A missing piece in a system that was supposed to record everything. Nicole's posture shifted again, her confidence pulling back slightly as she tried to fill the space. "It may not have synced yet," she said, but even she could hear the weakness in that explanation. Ethan watched the exchange without interruption, his expression calm, but his eyes more focused now, like he had been waiting for this exact moment, not with anticipation, but with recognition. Across the aisle, the young woman with the phone took a small step closer, her voice low but clear as she spoke into the recording. "There is no timestamp," she repeated softly, not to challenge, but to capture, to make sure the detail was not lost. The captain straightened slowly, handing the device back to Nicole without comment, but the silence that followed was different now. It was no longer uncertain. It was directional. He turned back to Ethan, his expression no longer neutral, but thoughtful, measured in a way that suggested he was no longer looking at a simple passenger dispute. "Sir," he said, his tone shifting slightly, more deliberate now, "did anyone inform you of this reassignment before you boarded?" Ethan met his gaze without hesitation. "No," he replied. "I checked in under my name. I boarded under my name. And I sat down in the seat assigned to my name." Each sentence was simple, factual, and impossible to distort. The captain nodded slowly, absorbing the clarity of it, and for the first time, the structure of the situation began to tilt. Behind him, Brian shifted his weight, his earlier confidence now replaced by something less stable, something closer to uncertainty. Nicole remained still, her eyes fixed forward, but the control she had held at the beginning was no longer absolute. It was slipping, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough for everyone in that cabin to feel it. And Ethan Cole, still seated, still calm, did not need to raise his voice to be heard, because the system itself had just started answering for him. The shift did not come with a loud moment or a clear turning point, it came quietly. Almost invisibly, like pressure building beneath the surface until the structure above it could no longer pretend everything was stable. Captain Pierce remained still for a second longer than expected, his gaze no longer divided, no longer uncertain, but focused now in a way that suggested he was no longer managing a situation, he was evaluating it. Nicole sensed it immediately, the subtle change in posture, the way authority was no longer flowing through her but around her, and she stepped forward again, trying to regain control before it slipped any further. "Captain, with respect, we have procedures for this," she said, her voice measured but tighter now, as if holding together a version of events that was beginning to unravel. "We cannot delay boarding over a single passenger." The phrase landed, but it did not carry the same weight anymore. A few passengers exchanged glances, not openly challenging, but no longer neutral. The moment had moved past inconvenience. It had meaning now. Ethan did not react to her words. He did not defend himself again. Instead, he did something even more unsettling. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, not quickly, not dramatically, just with the same calm precision he had shown from the beginning. He unlocked it, tapped once, then held it loosely in his hand, not showing it yet, not offering it as proof, just holding it like someone who understood timing better than urgency. The captain noticed. "Is there something you would like to add, sir?" he asked, his tone now more deliberate, more open than before. Ethan looked at him, then at Nicole, then briefly at Brian, his gaze steady, unhurried. "Not yet," he said quietly. The words were simple, but they carried something behind them, something that suggested this moment was not the end of the conversation, but the beginning of something larger. Brian shifted again, discomfort now visible in the way he adjusted his stance, his earlier certainty replaced by something less defined. "This is getting out of hand," he muttered, more to the situation than to anyone in particular, but the statement did not land the way he expected. No one agreed. No one moved. The cabin remained still, but not passive. Watching. Waiting. The young woman recording lowered her phone slightly, just enough to whisper to the man beside her, "He is not bluffing," and even though the words were soft, they carried. Ethan heard them. He did not turn, did not acknowledge, but something in his expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, like confirmation of something he already knew. Captain Pierce took a slow breath, then made a decision, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the kind of authority that did not need to announce itself. "We are going to verify this properly," he said, his tone calm but firm, leaving no room for interruption. He turned to Nicole. "Pull the full passenger log for this flight. Not just the current display. I want the original assignment record." Nicole froze for half a second, just long enough for it to matter, then nodded, her fingers moving again across the screen, faster now, less controlled. The device responded with a soft glow, lines of data shifting, updating, revealing more than the simplified version she had relied on earlier. The captain waited. Ethan waited. The entire cabin seemed to lean into that screen without moving an inch. And then it appeared. A name. A timestamp. A record that had not been there before, or at least not where it should have been. Nicole's hand paused. Brian leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. The captain stepped in, reading it for himself, and the silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was heavy. Because the system had just corrected itself. And when it did not just confirm a seat. It confirmed a mistake. Ethan Cole's name sat exactly where it had always been assigned, unchanged, untouched, as if the system itself was refusing to cooperate with the version of reality that had been presented moments earlier. The captain straightened slowly, his gaze lifting from the screen back to Ethan, and this time, there was no hesitation in his eyes. Only realization. And for the first time since this began, the question was no longer whether Ethan belonged in that seat. It was why anyone had tried to make it seem like he did not. The air in the cabin did not explode into chaos, it tightened, pulled inward like a breath no one wanted to release, because the truth had just surfaced without needing to be announced. Captain Pierce did not raise his voice. He did not react dramatically. He simply looked at the screen one more time, then turned it slightly toward Nicole, not to question, but to confirm what was already undeniable. His seat was never reassigned, he said, calm and precise, each word landing with quiet authority that no longer needed reinforcement. Nicole's expression shifted, not all at once, but in fragments, the certainty she had worn from the beginning cracking under the weight of something she could not argue with. There must be a delay in the system earlier, she said quickly, but the explanation came too late, too thin, like a structure built after the foundation had already collapsed. Brian looked between them, his earlier confidence now replaced with something closer to calculation, as if he was trying to determine how far this moment would go and whether he could step out of it before it reached him. The couple standing in the aisle no longer looked comfortable. The man adjusted his jacket, glancing briefly at Ethan, then away, while the woman lowered her gaze entirely, as if the seat they had been waiting for now carried a weight they did not want. Ethan remained exactly where he had been, unmoved, unshaken, his posture unchanged, his silence now louder than anything said around him. He did not ask for an apology. He did not demand correction. He simply existed in the truth that had just been confirmed, and that made everything else feel smaller. A voice from the back of the cabin spoke again, louder this time, no longer cautious. So he was right the whole time, the man said, not asking, but stating, and the words traveled forward like a current that no one could stop. Nicole opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Because this was no longer about explanation. It was about exposure. Captain Pierce straightened, his decision now fully formed, his role no longer to mediate, but to correct. Mr. Cole is in his assigned seat, he said, his tone final, leaving no space for reinterpretation. Then he turned slightly toward the couple. We will assist you in finding your correct seating. It was not an apology, not yet, but it was a shift, clear and irreversible. The couple nodded quietly, stepping back into the aisle without argument, their earlier confidence replaced by something more restrained, more aware. Nicole stood still, the device in her hand now lowered, no longer a tool of authority, but a reminder of how quickly control could change. Brian took a small step back, distancing himself just enough to suggest he had not been the one leading the moment, though everyone in the cabin knew better. Ethan finally moved, but not in the way anyone expected. He did not stand. He did not gesture. He simply leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees, his gaze steady on the captain. Thank you for verifying, he said, his voice calm, respectful, but carrying something deeper beneath it, something that suggested the situation had not ended, only shifted. The captain met his gaze, and for the first time, there was a trace of something else in his expression, not just authority, but awareness, the kind that comes when a situation reveals more than it first appears. It should have been verified before this point, the captain replied, his tone measured, and that acknowledgement hung in the air longer than any apology could have. The young woman with the phone lowered it slightly, her recording still running, her her eyes moving between Ethan and the crew, sensing what everyone else was beginning to feel. This was not over. Because the mistake had been corrected. But the reason behind it had not been addressed. And in that gap, in that silence that followed, something else was beginning to rise, something that had nothing to do with a seat, and everything to do with what came next. The cabin settled, but it was not peace, it was something heavier, something unresolved, like a storm that had paused just long enough for everyone to realize it was still there. Ethan leaned back again, slow and controlled, his shoulders easing into the seat that had just been confirmed as his, but his eyes did not soften, they sharpened, not in anger, but in memory. Because this moment was not new. It only looked different on the surface. 20 years earlier, he had stood in a much smaller airport, wearing a pressed button-down shirt and holding a printed ticket in hands that were steady but uncertain, watching a gate agent look at him, then at the ticket, then back at him again with the same pause, the same calculation, the same quiet doubt that did not need to be spoken out loud. "Are you sure you are in the right boarding group?" she had asked back then, her voice polite, almost careful, but the message underneath had been clear enough to stay with him long after the flight had taken off without him. He had stepped aside that day, not because he agreed, but because he did not yet have the language, the leverage, or the power to challenge it, and he remembered standing there as other passengers walked past him, scanning their tickets without question, without hesitation, without being asked to prove they belonged. That memory did not live in anger. It lived in precision. It shaped decisions. It built something over time that did not rely on permission. Back in the present, the quiet hum of the cabin returned, but it was different now, layered with awareness, with the weight of what had just been revealed. Ethan's gaze drifted briefly to the window again, the runway still waiting, the aircraft still grounded, as if time itself had paused to allow this moment to fully unfold. Then he looked forward again, his expression calm, but his eyes carrying something deeper, something settled. Nicole stood a few steps away, no longer speaking, no longer directing, her posture uncertain in a way that had not existed before, as if the role she had been playing no longer fit the situation she was now standing in. Brian had moved slightly to the side, his presence smaller now, quieter, as if distance alone could soften his involvement. Captain Pierce remained near the aisle, composed, but not detached, his awareness sharper, his attention no longer split between procedure and perception, but aligned with something more grounded. Ethan reached for his phone again, not abruptly, not with urgency, but with intention, the screen lighting up as his thumb moved with quiet familiarity, selecting a contact without hesitation. He raised it to his ear, his voice low, controlled, but carrying clearly enough for those closest to hear. "It is Ethan," he said, not introducing himself, not explaining, just stating presence. A brief pause. "Then, we have a situation on Flight 247. I need full review initiated. All logs. Boarding records. Crew actions." His tone did not rise. It did not demand. It directed. The difference was subtle, but unmistakable. The young woman recording glanced at the man beside her, her eyes widening slightly, because this no longer felt like a passenger handling a complaint. This felt structured. Intentional. Brian frowned, looking toward Nicole as if expecting her to respond, to interrupt, to reclaim control, but she did not move. She was listening now. Everyone was. Ethan continued, his voice steady. "Do not escalate publicly yet. Just start the process." Another pause. Then, quieter, almost reflective, "Yes. I am still on board." He lowered the phone slowly, not with tension, not with hesitation, but with finality, placing it back into his hand as if it had just shifted something beyond the cabin itself. Captain Pierce watched him closely now, not with suspicion, but with recognition that something larger had just been set into motion. "Mr. Cole," the captain said carefully, "is there something else we need to be aware of?" Ethan met his gaze, calm as ever, but this time, there was no softness in his eyes, only clarity. "That depends," he replied quietly, "on how far this needs to go." And in that moment, the cabin understood something it had not fully grasped before. This was never just about a seat. It was about a system. And that system had just been asked to answer for itself. No one spoke immediately after that, not because there was nothing to say, but because something had just shifted beyond the reach of casual conversation. The weight in the cabin deepened, not loud, not chaotic, but unmistakable, like everyone had stepped into a moment that was no longer ordinary. Nicole finally moved, but slower this time, her confidence no longer leading her steps, her voice carefully measured as if every word now carried consequences she had not considered before. "Sir, there is no need to escalate this further," she said, attempting to regain a sense of control, but the tone lacked the authority it once had, replaced by something closer to caution. Ethan did not respond right away. He looked at her, not with frustration, not with satisfaction, but with a calm that made her statement feel incomplete before it even settled. "It was already escalated," he said quietly, his voice even, his gaze steady, "the moment I was told I did not belong in a seat that was assigned to me." The sentence did not rise in volume, but it carried across the nearby rows, settling into the space like a fact no one could reshape. Brian shifted again, this time stepping slightly behind Nicole, his earlier presence now reduced, as if proximity alone could distance him from the direction this was heading. Captain Pierce remained still, his posture composed, but his attention now fully aligned with Ethan, no longer balancing perspectives, but observing something unfold with increasing clarity. A soft chime echoed from the front of the cabin, followed by a faint notification sound from multiple devices almost at the same time, subtle but synchronized, like a signal moving through a system beyond the plane itself. Nicole's handheld device lit up again, this time not from her input, but from an incoming message, the screen shifting rapidly as new information appeared. She looked down, her eyes scanning, and for the first time since this began, her composure broke in a way that could not be hidden. "Captain," she said, her voice lower now, controlled but strained, "we are receiving a priority alert from operations." The captain extended his hand without hesitation, and she passed the device to him, the movement careful, almost reluctant. He read in silence, his expression tightening just slightly, not with confusion, but with recognition of something larger than a routine issue. The passengers closest to the aisle leaned subtly, not enough to be obvious, but enough to feel connected to whatever was happening on that screen. Ethan remained seated, his posture unchanged, his attention steady, as if the unfolding moment was not surprising, only expected. The captain lifted his gaze from the device and looked directly at Ethan, this time without any uncertainty. "Mr. Cole," he said slowly, choosing his words with precision, "Operations is requesting immediate confirmation of your presence on this flight." A faint ripple moved through the cabin, quiet but undeniable, as the words settled into place. Ethan nodded once, not surprised, not impressed, just acknowledging the process he had already set in motion. "You can confirm it," he replied, his voice calm, almost indifferent to the weight of the request. The captain held his gaze for a moment longer, then looked back at the screen, tapping once, then again, sending the confirmation through a system that had already begun reacting before anyone on board fully understood why. Nicole stood frozen beside him, her earlier certainty now replaced by something closer to realization, as if the scale of what was happening had finally reached her. Brian did not speak at all. The couple who had been waiting for the seat now stood further back, no longer part of the situation, only witnesses to it. And in the quiet that followed, the truth began to take shape, not as a sudden reveal, but as a slow, undeniable shift. Because this was no longer about a misunderstanding. It was about a chain of decisions, a pattern of assumptions, and a system that had just been forced to look at itself in real time. Ethan Cole did not need to raise his voice, did not need to explain who he was, because the system was already doing that for him. And as the cabin waited, the next step was no longer a question of who was right, but what would happen now that the truth had been seen. The confirmation did not travel alone, it triggered something deeper, something faster, like a signal sent into a system that had been waiting for a reason to respond. Captain Pierce's device vibrated again, this time more sharply, followed by a second notification layered over the first, and then another, each one arriving with increasing urgency, as if multiple departments had just been pulled into the same moment at once. He looked down, scanning quickly, his expression tightening not from confusion, but from the realization that this was no longer contained within the aircraft. "Operations has escalated this to executive review," he said, his voice lower now, more deliberate, as if even the words needed to be handled carefully. A quiet ripple moved through the nearby rows, not loud, but unmistakable, because the phrase executive review did not belong in a conversation about seating. Nicole took a small step back, her hands now still at her sides, the device no longer in her control, her authority replaced by something far less certain. Brian looked between them, his earlier posture gone entirely, his presence now reduced to observation rather than involvement. Ethan remained seated, calm as ever, his gaze steady, not surprised, not impressed, simply present as the system began to reveal itself. The captain's device chimed again, and this time he did not keep the screen to himself. He turned it slightly, enough for Nicole to see, enough for the truth to be shared without being announced. Her eyes moved across the screen, and whatever she saw there removed the last trace of resistance from her expression. "They are asking for full incident documentation," she said quietly, her voice no longer carrying authority, only acknowledgement. The captain nodded once, then looked back at Ethan, his tone shifting again, not just respectful now, but aware. "Mr. Cole, I need to understand something clearly," he said, choosing his words with precision. "Your call just now, who exactly did you contact?" The question did not challenge. It clarified. Ethan met his gaze without hesitation, his expression composed, his voice steady. "The people responsible for the deal this flight is tied to," he said. The sentence landed heavier than anything before it, because it connected something no one in the cabin had considered. This was not just a flight. It was part of something larger. The captain's eyes narrowed slightly, not in doubt, but in focus. "What deal?" he asked, quieter now. Ethan held his gaze for a moment longer, then answered, not with hesitation, but with the same calm certainty he had carried from the beginning. "The one funding your new international expansion," he said. The silence that followed was different from all the others. It was not tension. It was impact. Nicole's breath caught slightly, her eyes shifting back to the screen as if searching for confirmation she already knew was there. Brian did not move at all. The couple who had once waited for the seat now stood further back, completely removed, their earlier confidence replaced by something closer to disbelief. Captain Pierce looked at Ethan, really looked at him now, not as a passenger, not as a problem, but as someone positioned far beyond the situation unfolding in front of him. "You are saying you are connected to that level of decision-making," the captain said carefully. Ethan did not smile this time. He did not soften the moment. He simply answered. "I am saying this flight exists within a system," he replied, his voice quiet, precise, "and I am part of the group that decides whether that system continues as planned." The words did not rise. They did not need to. Because in that moment, the scale of everything changed. The cabin was no longer a contained space. It was a point inside a much larger structure, one that had just been activated. And for the first time, the crew was no longer managing a passenger. They were standing inside a decision they did not control. The words did not echo, but they expanded, filling the cabin in a way no raised voice ever could, because what Ethan had just said was not a threat, it was context. And context changes everything. No one moved at first. No one spoke. Even the quiet background sounds of the aircraft seemed to fade, like the environment itself was recalibrating around a new understanding. Captain Pierce held Ethan's gaze for a moment longer, then slowly looked down at the device in his hand again, this time not searching for answers, but confirming what had already begun to align. The screen lit up with another incoming message, longer this time, more detailed, and as he read, the structure of his posture shifted, not dramatically, but enough for those watching closely to see it. Nicole saw it. Brian saw it. And neither of them said a word. "We have just received direct instruction from corporate," the captain said finally, his tone controlled but unmistakably different now, no longer neutral, no longer procedural, but precise. The phrase landed like a quiet announcement of authority moving from one level to another. Nicole's eyes widened slightly, her earlier certainty now completely replaced by attention, by the realization that the situation had moved beyond anything she could influence. "Instruction regarding what?" she asked, her voice careful, almost hesitant. The captain did not look at her right away. He continued reading for a second longer, then lifted his gaze, first to Ethan, then to the rest of the cabin, as if acknowledging that what he was about to say was no longer contained within a private exchange. "Immediate internal review of all crew conduct on this flight," he said. A pause. Then, more specifically, effective immediately. The words settled heavily, not because they were loud, but because they were final. Brian took a small step back, his shoulders tightening, his eyes moving quickly between the captain and Nicole as if searching for a response that did not exist. Nicole stood completely still, her expression now fully stripped of the authority she had carried at the beginning, replaced by something far more human, something closer to awareness. The young woman recording lowered her phone just slightly, not because the moment was less important, but because it had become something else entirely, something bigger than documentation. It was unfolding in real time. Ethan remained seated, calm, composed, his presence unchanged, as if none of this surprised him, as if this was simply the natural conclusion of a process he had already initiated. The captain took a slow breath, then continued. His tone steady but now carrying the weight of accountability. "We are also instructed to delay departure until review protocols are confirmed," he added. That detail shifted the room again, because now the impact was no longer abstract. It was immediate. The flight itself had been paused. Not by weather. Not by maintenance. But by a decision. Nicole finally spoke, her voice lower now, almost restrained. "Captain, that will affect the entire schedule," she said, but even as she said it, the argument felt incomplete because the decision had already been made at a level beyond scheduling. The captain nodded once, not dismissing her, but not changing course. "I am aware," he replied. Then he looked at Ethan again, and this time, there was no uncertainty, no distance, only clarity. "Mr. Cole, corporate is requesting a direct line with you." The cabin absorbed that sentence slowly, because it confirmed what many had already begun to suspect but had not yet fully understood. Ethan was not just connected to the situation. He was central to it. Ethan did not react with surprise. He did not lean forward or reach immediately for his phone. He simply nodded once, calm and measured, as if this was expected, as if this was always where the moment was heading. "They know how to reach me," he said quietly. And in that moment, the final shift occurred, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute. The crew was no longer in control of the situation. The system was no longer responding to them. It was responding to him. And everyone in that cabin understood it at the same time. The request did not create movement, it created stillness, the kind that settles in when a room understands that whatever happens next will not be small. Captain Pierce lowered the device slightly, his posture no longer carrying command but responsibility, and for the first time since the situation began, he stepped back half a pace, not out of uncertainty, but out of recognition that the center of control had shifted completely. All eyes moved to Ethan, not dramatically, not all at once, but inevitably, like gravity had changed direction. He did not stand. He did not adjust his posture. He simply reached for his phone again, calm, deliberate, the same way he had from the beginning, and as the screen lit up, the faint reflection of the cabin lights passed across his face, steady and composed. He tapped once, then raised the phone to his ear. "Go ahead," he said, his voice low, controlled, as if he was stepping into a conversation already in progress. There was no introduction, no explanation, just alignment. A pause followed, not long, but enough for those closest to sense that something substantial was being said on the other end. Ethan listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, his eyes focused forward, not on the crew, not on the passengers, but somewhere beyond them, as if the plane itself was no longer the setting that mattered. Then he spoke again, each word measured, precise. "I want the deal paused," he said. The sentence landed quietly, but its impact moved instantly through the cabin, not because everyone understood the details, but because they understood the weight. "Effective immediately," he added, his tone unchanged, not raised, not emphasized, just final. Nicole's breath caught almost imperceptibly, her eyes shifting between Ethan and the captain, as if trying to reconcile what she was hearing with what she believed was possible. Brian stood completely still now, his earlier presence reduced to silence, his gaze fixed on the floor for a brief moment before lifting again, uncertain, searching. Captain Pierce did not interrupt. He did not question. He listened, because whatever was happening was no longer his to control. Ethan continued, his voice steady, unwavering. "Yes, I am aware of the implications," he said, responding to something only he could hear, and then, after a brief pause, "that is exactly why we are doing it now." The words did not rush. They did not hesitate. They carried the certainty of someone who had already considered every outcome. The young woman recording lowered her phone completely now, her attention no longer split between documenting and understanding, because understanding had taken over. This was no longer a moment to capture. It was a moment to witness. Ethan listened again, his head tilting slightly, his expression sharpening just a fraction, then nodding once, slow and deliberate. "Begin the review at the crew level first," he said. "Then escalate to regional oversight. I want a full report before the end of the day." He paused, then added, quieter but no less firm, "No exceptions." The cabin absorbed every word, not because they were loud, but because they were structured, intentional, part of something that extended far beyond this flight. Ethan lowered the phone slowly, ending the call without ceremony, without emphasis, as if the action itself was already complete the moment he spoke. He placed the phone back into his hand, resting it lightly against his leg, his posture returning to stillness, but the space around him had changed completely. Captain Pierce looked at him, not as a passenger, not even as a point of authority, but as someone who had just altered the trajectory of something much larger than this aircraft. Nicole remained frozen, her earlier decisions now echoing back at her in a way she could not undo. Brian did not speak at all. And in that quiet, grounded moment, the truth settled fully into place. This was never about a seat. It was about power, not loud, not aggressive, but precise, patient, and absolute. And it had just been exercised without a single raised voice. No one rushed to fill the silence after that call ended, because it no longer felt like a space that needed words, it felt like a line that had already been crossed, something final, something irreversible. The cabin remained still, but it was no longer tense in the same way, it was settled, like a truth had arrived and taken its place whether anyone was ready for it or not. Captain Pierce stood upright, his shoulders squared, but his expression no longer carried authority in the way it had before, it carried accountability, the kind that comes when a moment demands more than control, it demands recognition. He looked at Ethan, not briefly, not cautiously, but directly, and for the first time, there was no distance between how he saw him and who he understood him to be. "Mr. Cole," the captain said, his voice steady, measured, but unmistakably respectful, "on behalf of this crew, I want to acknowledge that this situation should not have occurred. It was not dramatic. It was not emotional. But it was real, and that made it land deeper than anything else that had been said." Nicole lowered her gaze, her posture no longer defensive, no longer rigid, but still, as if she had finally stepped out of the role she had been holding onto and into the reality of what had happened. Brian stood quietly beside her, saying nothing, because there was nothing left to say that could reshape the moment. Ethan listened, his expression calm, unchanged, not softened by the apology, not hardened by what came before, just present, steady, as if the outcome had never been about hearing those words. He gave a small nod, not as acceptance, not as dismissal, but as acknowledgement, and then he spoke, his voice low, clear, carrying through the cabin without effort. "This was never about the seat," he said. The sentence settled immediately, understood without explanation. It was about the assumption behind it. No one interrupted. No one shifted. Because everyone in that space knew exactly what he meant. The young woman who had been recording lowered her phone completely now, her attention no longer divided, her expression thoughtful, reflective, as if she was processing something beyond what she had captured. The couple who had once waited for the seat stood quietly in the aisle, no longer part of the moment, only witnesses to it, their earlier certainty replaced by something quieter, something more aware. Ethan leaned back slightly, his gaze moving once toward the window, where the runway still waited, unchanged, steady, as if reminding everyone that the world outside had not stopped, even though something inside this cabin had shifted permanently. Then he looked forward again, his voice steady, final. "You did not mistake my seat," he said. A pause. "You misjudged my place." The words did not rise, but they carried, settling into every corner of the cabin, leaving no room for misunderstanding. Captain Pierce nodded slowly, not in agreement alone, but in recognition of the weight behind the statement, and for a moment, the authority he held felt secondary to the truth that had just been spoken. The aircraft remained grounded, the departure delayed, the system paused, but something else had already moved forward. Not loudly. Not visibly. But undeniably. Ethan Cole did not stand. He did not demand anything further. He did not look for validation or reaction. Because the outcome had already been decided the moment the system was forced to answer itself. And as the quiet hum of the cabin slowly returned, different now, more aware, more deliberate, one thing was clear to everyone who had witnessed it. Power does not always announce itself. Sometimes, it sits still, waits, and lets the truth do all the work.